Today on The Nation Speaks, are federal vaccine mandates on private companies and healthcare workers legal? It's now up to the Supreme Court to decide. The Honorable Robert Henneke, who argued against mandates before the Fifth Circuit Court, tells us what to expect. Next, Derek Chauvin, Kyle Rittenhouse, Kim Potter. 2021 has been a year of trials making headlines. In America Q&A, we ask if you'd want to be on the jury in a high-profile case. When it comes to vaccines and the potential for a bad reaction, some professions have special risks. Pilot Cody Flint explains. Finally, as we welcome in 2022 in our second America Q&A, we ask, what did you learn in 2021? Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. On Friday, the U.S. Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in appeals to stop two separate federal vaccine mandates. The first, under the Labor Department's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, applies to businesses with 100 or more employees. The second, under Health and Human Services Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, applies to healthcare workers at facilities that receive Medicare and Medicaid funding. Together, the mandates affect over 100 million U.S. workers. Lower courts have already at least partially blocked both of those mandates, bringing us to where we are now. Enforcement measures are temporarily on hold as many in the nation wait in limbo to see what the highest court will rule. The situation is unusual, complicated, and consequential. Here to help explain why is the Honorable Robert Henneke, Executive Director and General Counsel at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He knows the case as well, having successfully argued for the stay of the OSHA mandate for Texas in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Cindy, thank you for having me.
So let's start by discussing what is unusual about the Supreme Court's handling of these cases. Friday, the full court will hear an hour of oral arguments for each case, which might not sound like a lot, but as I understand it, in emergency applications like these, usually the court doesn't hear any oral arguments. So why is it the court decided to break with precedent, and what does that mean?
Well, what's unusual about the posture before the court this Friday is that these are motions, emergency motions that were filed with the court, asking the court to step in and stop the federal vaccine mandates from being enforced and going into effect. Normally, the court resolves motions by simple issuing a paper order, but here the court has granted a full hour of argument to discuss the important constitutional and federal questions that are involved in these cases.
So what does this mean in terms of what we can expect? Now, normally on these cases, they're just looking at procedural issues, but I understand here we're going to have to look at the merits of the case as well. So what sort of arguments do you expect to be being brought forth?
I think the primary arguments are going to focus on the constitutional questions that were the focus of our lawsuit that we filed to challenge the private employer vaccine mandate, that the federal government simply does not have the power to command or coerce individuals to undertake a medical procedure that they do not want to have for themselves. Furthermore, you're going to hear argument that the statute that the Biden administration is relying upon through OSHA just simply does not give the executive branch the authority to require vaccines in connection with workplace safety or to coerce healthcare workers to be required to be vaccinated as a condition of receiving federal funding.
And will this decision have any impact on what municipalities or states are able to do?
Where I think the Supreme Court will strike down the federal vaccine mandates, the outcome of these cases will not resolve the power that states may have to implement similar regulations on a state-by-state basis.
And do you expect that there might be a split between the OSHA mandate and the CMS mandate? And if so, what would be the basis of that?
I think you're talking about different constitutional powers as the basis for each mandate. For the private employer mandate, the federal government argues that the Commerce Clause, the federal power to regulate interstate commerce, gives it the authority to require vaccines for people who are in the workplace. With the healthcare mandate, these are tied to the spending programs of Medicaid and Medicare. And I think the federal government is likely going to argue that it's constitutional for the federal government to attach conditions to federal programs the red tape that are commonplace with these programs. Now, I think the court's going to find that in each of these mandates, the federal government had gone too far and is unconstitutionally acting in a way that it is not allowed.
The arguments being presented, or what the court is going to have to consider, touch on a lot of issues that have been coming up. Federal government overreach, whether there's sympathy for objectors or not, and the executive branch's powers when it comes to public safety issues. Where do you think the justices lie on some of these questions?
I think the majority of the court will hold similar in the same vein to when the court struck down the residential eviction moratorium this past summer, that the federal government cannot just look to a statute and invent a power for itself that's unprecedented. And here, OSHA has never had the authority in any of its statutes to mandate vaccines for workers. So I think the court will find that this is beyond the federal authority that the executive branch has, but will reserve the right to, consider state vaccine mandates on a case-by-case basis. My prediction is that you'll have at least 3 members of the court, Justices Thomas, Gorsuch, and Alito, who will find the entire concept of vaccine mandates unconstitutional. You'll have the liberal justices, Breyer, Kagan, and Sotomayor, who will find that this is fully within the federal government's powers to implement. The swing votes will come with the middle 3, Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. And where I think that they will fall is that they will find that the statute that the federal government relies upon does not give OSHA the authority to do this. So they'll agree with the conservative justices in striking down the vaccine mandates, but not necessarily agree in terms of the constitutional questions.
And would that be the same for the CMS mandate then?
That one's going to be a closer call because I think it's going to be tied to the spending clause and to the extent with which the federal government can set conditions in terms of being able to participate in a federal program like Medicaid or Medicare. So really, I think that that's going to be a toss-up. It'll be a 5-4 decision, and it'll turn on the Chief Justice as far as his determination about how far the federal government can go in using these type of conditions tied to funding to intrude upon individual autonomy and privacy. All
right. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll eagerly be watching the outcome of these cases. Coming up, vaccine injury is still a taboo topic, but the consequences of pretending the problem doesn't exist could be greater than you might think. But first, 2021 saw a number of big trials. Derek Chauvin convicted in the killing of George Floyd, Kyle Rittenhouse, Jussie Smollett, Kim Potter, and now Ghislaine Maxwell. In each case, jury members know they are under the microscope. In America Q&A, we ask if you'd want to be a jury member in a high-profile case.